come along with me. We're going to talk about the exhibits, what you can expect. We're going to play a little music along the way as well. So let's experience bluegrass together. I'm going back to old Kentucky. There's a sea by Lindaloo. I'm going back to old Kentucky, where the skies are so blue. Hey, Chris Joslin here, Executive Director at the Bluegrass Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Owensboro, Kentucky. And I know as you plan your trip and think about what you're going to experience when you come visit the Hall of Fame, I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight, give you just a little taste of what you can expect, and there's so much to experience here at the Bluegrass Music Hall of Fame and Museum. We're continuing through the exhibits, the core exhibits that essentially tell the story of bluegrass. We're moving on to roughly the late 50s to the early 70s, mid-late 50s to the early 70s. And I mentioned previously that bluegrass music was not really referred to as bluegrass music. Initially, it was just part of country music. You know, country music was pretty textured in those days. It included old-time string band. It included artists like Bill Monroe. It included cowboy music and gospel music and western swing, and so all these great genres. But all that changed when Elvis Presley came on the scene in the mid-50s and started really having an impact in shaping popular music. And one of the ways that affected a lot of musicians like Bill Monroe is that country music commercially began to respond to that with more electric instruments and drums and bigger production, and trying to separate themselves from kind of the hillbilly stereotype, which was good for country music to compete, but it made it difficult for bluegrass music because suddenly old-time string band related music seemed a little old-fashioned. But I like to refer to this section as Bluegrass Gets a Name, because it kind of forced bluegrass into its own. And it's interesting what happened. Some artists responded to this new commercialization, like Flatt and Scruggs, for instance. They responded by more corporate sponsorship through Martha White. They got into to television, like the Beverly Hillbillies, and even film. You know, playing a lot of the soundtrack to Bonnie and Clyde. You know, other artists responded to by aligning more with country music. You know, I think about Jimmy Martin. I think about the Osborne Brothers and Reno and Smiley. So they started making records that would compete well in that new reality of country music, and they had a lot of success there. Other artists like Bill Monroe and the Stanley Brothers, they were really discovered by a younger audience, college students who were gravitating more to folk music. And in fact, some of these exhibit cases talk about that. In fact, here's something from Esquire magazine in 1959 where they refer to folk music with overdrive, and they were referring to the sounds of Bill Monroe, to Flatt and Scruggs, all these great bluegrass artists. Certainly Pete Seeger was leading the charge in terms of folk music, but the byproduct of that is that a lot of young folks, a whole new generation of enthusiasts, players and enthusiasts, started discovering these great bluegrass artists. And it was during this era too that show promoters and radio folks and people who were writing articles about the music started referring to the music as bluegrass specifically. And that really was a result of Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, because a lot of these, he led the charge, and he was the big personality in the middle of this music that a lot of artists were emulating. And so people just started referring to it as bluegrass music in the manner of Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys from the state of Kentucky. And again, here's more highlights of the Osborne Brothers, Jim and Jesse, Mac Wiseman, Reno and Smiley, some of the artists that really flourished during this time. Another thing that was happening, you know, the story of bluegrass really is kind of the story of America during this era. A lot of people from the South were moving to the upper Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic area, the Northeast, really in more industrialized areas, looking for work. And they took their music with them. They took their culture with them, and the music was a big part of that. So that's why we're standing in really what looks like an urban bar, because a lot of bluegrass music flourished in those settings, because people from the Southeast started taking their bluegrass music to Boston. They started taking it to New York, to Dayton, to Washington, D.C., into these more urban environments. And oftentimes this is where bluegrass was played, where bluegrass musicians connected. I also mentioned that this is where bluegrass music crept into the mainstream. And think about Flatt and Scruggs playing the theme to the Beverly Hillbillies. And I mentioned earlier Bonnie and Clyde. So here's a banjo tune by Earl Scruggs. It was actually recorded in the 50s that they brought back in the late 60s as part of the Bonnie and Clyde soundtrack called Foggy Mountain Breakdown. Perhaps arguably one of Earl Scruggs' most popular songs, and I'm sure the movie had a lot to do that. So let's play a little Foggy Mountain Breakdown by Earl Scruggs.